All right, we are live for our first panel as part of the Free Play 2015 online festival. So thanks for joining us. It's going to be a really, really great one to start with, I think. So I'm Dan Golding, Free Play Director, and I'm going to be chairing this panel. So first off, before we begin, thanks to our online festival sponsors, Surprise Attack, and also just a little bit of info about Free Play. We're running all week here in Melbourne currently in Australia, and we've still got tickets to our symposium on Sunday the 19th available, so visit freeplay.net.au for more info about that. So today, this panel is called Australia from the Outside. And we're speaking with three amazing Australian game developers living and working overseas to find out what the view is like from abroad. So joining us, we've got Alex Hutchinson. Alex is a creative director at Ubisoft Montreal. Most recently, he directed Far Cry 4, Assassin's Creed 3, and Army of Two 40th Day, which has so far sold over 20 million copies and picked up various awards along the way, including a few from the Academy of Interactive Arts and Sciences, a Game Award, and the odd BAFTA. He was previously lead designer on Spore and The Sims 2, and has written for mags like Edge, Games TM, and Play Nations, working at GDC, DICE, E3, MIGS, and of course now Free Play. Also, we've got Siobhan Reddy. Siobhan is a co-founder and studio director of Media Molecule, a developer in the UK best known for Little Big Planet and more recently for Tearaway, which I unashamedly loved, by the way. In 2013, Siobhan was named Australian Woman of the Year living in the UK by Qantas. And finally, we've got Bennett Foddy.
All those people.
Bennett is the creator of a number of games, including his well-known series of four-letter web games, QWOP, GURP, and CLOP. His work has been shown at MoMA, New York, and at the Pulse Art Fair, and in dozens of other museums and festivals around the world. He's currently at NYU's Game Center as an assistant arts professor in game design, following a period at Oxford University and Princeton. So, to begin with, can you tell us about your journey from Australia to working internationally? Bennett, perhaps we'll start with you.
Okay. Let's see. I mean, I guess it wasn't games that brought me outside of Australia in the first place. As anybody in Australia knows, it's one of the kind of bipartisan, perennially popular policies in Australian politics is to bleed money out of tertiary education. So there's not a lot in the way of great academic jobs. I was training as a philosopher, and that's where I did my PhD at Melbourne Uni in philosophy, and I got a job at Princeton University, which was a great opportunity. So that took me to New Jersey and later New York. And it was about that time I started sort of releasing these games. And later I got a job at Oxford, still in philosophy, and I kind of got a opportunity to just make a life change and go games full time, and now I'm teaching game design back in New York. Sort of a fantastic gig where I get to make games as well as teach people to make them. So yeah, that's it in a very brief nutshell, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Great, Siobhan.
Yeah, mine sort of also really, like, I left Australia when I was 18, and I had been, throughout my sort of teen years, sort of really into making like little fanzines and sort of into like seeing lots of music gigs and making short films and things like that. And so it wasn't necessarily games either. It was just I kind of just had a bit of a moment of madness and thought, oh, I know, I'll go live in England. And I'd worked for the year after I'd finished school. I'd worked in a sort of web company, and I'd sort of started to realize that that games, when I got to the UK, I realized that games kind of brought together a whole bunch of things that I was really interested in. It was very kind of DIY, and that people were just sort of getting up and sort of figuring out how to make them. And they also sort of combined technology and storytelling, and then also music and composition and art, and also all of these different interests that I had seemed to come together in games. And I basically just started looking for a job, and I was lucky enough to be hired by my now very good friend Lucy at a company called Perfect Entertainment, who was making the Discworld Noir games. And so I joined there as a production assistant and was basically just starting to learn the ropes, but I knew kind of absolutely nothing. And I left there probably about 6 months later, and I got a job. I had got a job working at Criterion Games. And at that point, Criterion was just sort of starting to shift from being purely a demonstration for renderware to actually wanting to make games that were fun. The first game that I worked on there was Trickstyle, and then I worked on Airblade, and then worked on Burnout for a few years. Yeah, and then we started Media Molecule in 2006. So yeah, I just sort of I think that rite of passage of probably leaving Australia was what weirdly got me into games.
That's really interesting. Alex?
Yeah, I guess I'm the outlier then, in that I was working in the games industry such as it was in Australia in 2002, and I saw the writing on the wall of the great disaster coming, and so realized that if I was going to have any future in the business, then I was in a similar position to Siobhan, where I was still very much learning the ropes and figuring out what I could do and what I should do and how I could add value. And then lucky enough to have a producer friend who'd gone to EA around that time, and he put my CV in, and I ended up getting a job at Maxis in 2003, which is a terrific place to learn because obviously all their games are systems driven, so they're kind of pure games. They're not about sort of delivering a linear experience or a controlled experience, but building systems and toys. So I couldn't imagine a better place to sort of learn the ropes as a designer. So I was there for a lot of years, worked on various Sims things and Spore, and then had the opportunity to go to Montreal to be creative director on the second Army 2 game. And then from there, ended up at Ubisoft in Montreal working on, as you said, on Assassins and Far Cry. And now hopefully it'll see the light of day, but hopefully a brand new thing. So we've been working for a year or so, a bit more on and off on a new thing. So fingers crossed.
Great. Cool. Exclusive. No.
Exclusive. I'm about to be fired. It's my last day.
I mean, you've almost all already answered my next question, which was going to be whether you think you would have ended up leaving Australia anyway. But Siobhan and Bennett, it sounds like you left Australia and then got into games rather than the other way around. So I guess maybe Alex, is that something that, like, was it satisfying an urge that you had anyway to travel?
Yeah, for sure. It wasn't so much a travel urge as an urge to have different experiences and get out there. And I guess it's like I'm sure every country has it to some extent, and I don't know how the others feel, but there was always that element that you were outside of the sort of main engine of development or engine of culture in Australia. We're very far away. And I don't think that's necessarily true. I think that's very much a young person's feeling that you often have, that important things are happening elsewhere. So I had a very, very strong desire to get somewhere where people were doing big things, and my interest was in games, so it was big games things. So I think I would have left. I was very lucky, though, because I often think that these days you wouldn't get a job. The same CV. It was very much a boom period where designers were rising, and no one knew what they were. And there were no, training programs and nothing to do. So I think if the same CV that I had then, if I was trying to get a job now, it'd be pretty excruciating. It's all connected to time and place and all that stuff as well.
I mean, one of the things I would say, just to my way of answering that question would be to say, when I was in Australia, I'm not sure if it was just the circles I was in, but I didn't really know anybody who was into games. I knew people who played them kind of casually, but there was not really, at least as far as I could find it, an intellectual scene around games. And it wasn't until I moved to America, and suddenly, there is a huge difference in just the number of people and how many different sort of demographics play games in America. It's like you see little old ladies playing Candy Crush on the trains, just something that I never saw in Australia. Maybe that's changed since I left, but it was just like, here was something that I'd loved my whole life, and I felt like I couldn't do it seriously in Australia, and it suddenly became like, oh, now I'm here, everybody just assumes that you can do this seriously. And so it was kind of opening doors for me that just had never seemed open in Australia.
Yeah, I had the same. I had the same feeling in a slightly different way. We're pitching ideas in Australia for a while, and again, it's hard to tell the circle you're in or not. But there was a lot of "that's impossible" sort of talk as well. Like, oh, I don't think that's. Why would you bother with that idea? Why would you try to say something serious? Why would you try this difficult thing? And maybe it was because at the time the industry was very much third party, and very much licensed product. But in the States, for me, it was amazing to find out people who would sit down, listen to an idea, and say, "Okay, let's give it a shot." So for me, it was a massive relief, and it changed my view on what you could do and how you could do it.
Is that a similar feeling for you, Siobhan?
Well, I mean, I was like a baby when I left Australia, really. I had just finished school. I'd done a bit of, a year of work, not even really a full year of working. And like, I'd always worked throughout my school years, but I was making my own sort of other projects at that point. So I didn't actually enter into the world of games until I was in England. And I think for a long time it was, what was probably unusual was there being an acceptance that what I was doing was interesting. And, I think that took a while. Like now, I think everybody sees games as being a very interesting thing to build, and, there's a lot of artistic merit to them, and, but I think that was probably that was probably more what I encountered when I would call back or tell people what I was doing. People would be like, "Oh, games, why do you care so much about them?" Like, well, they're cool, and the people are great, and I think actually that was the thing that really got me interested in making games, was the people that I made them with. There's just so many brilliant people in the games industry, and I think now then finally the types of games experiences that are being made, now it seems very socially acceptable to make games these days.
So, fast forwarding to today, the next thing that I wanted to ask is, what does Australia and what does Australian games or Australian games culture look like from your vantage point? I mean, what sort of news, what sort of games makes it across to you? And I mean, is it actually identifiable as Australian? Do you notice these things from where you are?
I think one of the things that happened over the last few years is Australians have started to pop up at GDC. I'm talking about the independent scene. So I guess in 2012, Harry Lee came across and was suddenly like kind of pimping all these other people's games, and then people who were behind those games start to show up as well. And it's evident, I guess, from the outside that there is like an independent scene now in Melbourne, sort of focused around RMIT and Acme that it didn't seem to be there when I was last living in Australia in 2007. So it does seem as though the kind of independent scene and maybe the academic scene has kind of like started to grow and to flourish a little bit. But yeah, I mean, that's based mainly on Australians making this long trek over to New York and to San Francisco for these events.
I mean, last year I was asked to speak at GCAP, and I was very interested in going to that because I didn't really have very much of a view of what was going on. And I think, like, we've been finalizing or getting a project ready, and I live often in a bit of a bubble of what's going on in our world here. But I was like amazed and so impressed with what was actually going on in Melbourne. I thought the arcade is a fantastic, absolutely fantastic place. So much energy, so many ideas, and so many brilliant things that are coming from that. That I left I think I was just like, I couldn't sit still in my seat when I was on my way back to England, because it was just like, I thought everything that I'd seen was so brilliant and exciting, and the people, all of the projects, that were being worked on since then, like I've seen some of them come out, like Crossy Road has come out, and that's really brilliant. And I've played as many as I can on the App Store because I've just sort of become quite invested in it. But what I've loved about it is that from little things, big things grow, and it feels like there's some really good decisions were made in order to like get people outside of their houses and working, and even if they were just going to work on their own, into a space that was shared, where they could actually share ideas, they could share skills, and from that sort of build a an interesting industry that's a little bit more self, well, you know, it's not third party, it's not work for hire, they're ideas that are just coming from people. And so I thought that was, so my view in at the moment is like, it looks pretty rock and roll, it's really interesting, and I hope that, and everything that I've been playing has been really fun. And I don't know whether or not I could say that there was an Australian aesthetic. Maybe it's maybe, you know, the games I've played have been a lot of them have been very funny. That's been, you know, that's an aspect. But I would love, like, especially because I am a very sentimental person. I watch whenever I'm homesick. I don't know if you guys do the same. Like, I immediately find Aussie television, Aussie movies, Aussie music, and I need to, like, you know, listen to, I'm gonna make like a lamb roast or some lamingtons or something. So like I do these things, and I would love to play something that was like quintessentially an Australian experience. And I don't. What would you guys think that would be? Do you have something that you would describe as that? Played anything that you would describe as quintessentially Australian?
No,
I guess. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I don't. I haven't actually. I think that's really interesting. And the you know, when I left in 2003, the current sort of scene was basically impossible. You know, to get a game out, you needed a publisher. To get a publisher, you needed to be, you know, somewhere else. You needed a budget. All the business, the distribution, the financing were all problematic. So really, the only choice was to go overseas. So I'm mostly excited that now, you know, dreams that I remember talking about with people in pubs in 2003. That, man, if we could just put this, you know, out ourselves, it would be different. We could test these ideas. You know, whether it's Steam or Good Old Games, or, you know, even just self-distributing something, it's, you know, or, you know, all the various, you know, different app stores and locations. It's really exciting, and I think that crossed with the sort of death of traditional third-party scene in Australia, I think is sort of blended together to give an opportunity to these new ideas. And so that's the most exciting thing for me, that these sort of, you know, the people that want to do it now in Melbourne or Sydney or Brisbane or wherever are the people that really want to make something interesting. You know, it's not really so much a job as a passion, and I think if you start from there, you can do something special. But I haven't seen a lot of Australian voices. You know, I don't know what we expect from that. I'm with Siobhan. It's like, are we expecting sort of a beach and a barbecue? I don't, you know, that would be sort of terribly lame. But I do think, you know, that it would be amazing if there was a tone. I mean, you can pretty much tell an American game. You can obviously, you know, generally tell a Japanese game. Canadian game, not so much. I think we tend to do sort of side versions of American tones a lot of the time. Maybe Ubisoft, we get a little French on things, a little esoteric and over-intellectual on some parts. But I think, you know, it would be great to see a voice. But yeah, no, I haven't seen anything yet.
I think on the independent side there is something starting to come through. I mean, I'm relieved that it's not in the format of where Australian film was in the 70s and 80s. And, you know, it's like it's not having to be Crocodile Dundee or Wake and Fright, the video game. I think the independent games...
Video game, though, that would be...
Terrifying.
Oh my god.
Yeah, that would be
amazing and terrifying. I don't know if I could play it. I'd be too scared.
Yeah, but you know, I do think that there is a kind of a tone in independent Australian games that's maybe an irreverent tone. I'm thinking of things like, you know, obviously the big superstars at the moment, you know, Crossy Road. I think Alex Bruce's game Antichamber is, you know, kind of original in that way. I'm thinking of Push Me, Pull You and Crawl. And those are all games that kind of subvert genre tropes in some way, and I think that is something that's typical of Australian independent games anyway.
Yeah. It's typical of independent games in general, though. You know what I mean? Like, I think there's that part of that, like, you know, there's a lot of that that any splinter group has that sense of reverence, which is cool. But yeah, I agree with you. I don't know what it would be if it wasn't that.
Right. Yeah, it's not boomerangs and kangaroos anyway.
Please God. Although I will say that anyone who makes a Australian-themed crocodile game is about to be. I swear to God, you're going to be rich. Do it for the dollars. Do it for the dollars.
I have actually been planning a kangaroo game. I did some voices on JS Joust as like an alternate voice set, and I was trying to make it sound as Australian as possible, and it really scratched an itch for me. It's something that I want to do. I need voice work that sounds way more Australian than my actual voice.
That would be
I'm
amazing.
happy to. That's what I want to do.
Literally getting an Australian accent out there.
Yeah.
I'm starting to channel it.
Yeah. I'm keeping an eye on the Twitter feed as well while this conversation is going, and it's interesting. A few people have honed on this idea of geographical distance being. I mean, it sounds like from the earlier discussion, it sounds like almost the geographical distance was the thing that needed to be overcome. And I mean, do you think this shift that you're talking about? In terms of what kinds of games are at least seen internationally, do you think that's because of the geographical shift being overcome, or something like that?
It's a much more level playing field. It's an infinitely more level playing field now. So I think that's exciting. That and there are lots of outlets and people who are willing to push new ideas and new content. The people are actively looking for it, and I don't think they really care where you come from now. But I still think there is the challenge of being there. As was said earlier, if you're at GDC, you can meet people, put it in their hands, you can get their face into it. There's PAX all over the place now, although PAX is in Australia, I think mostly because those guys want a vacation. But there's opportunities to get your game in front of people. But yeah, there is a need to get on the road as well. Even then, there is something to be said for being in the same room as other people.
I think we've lost Siobhan. We might see if we can get her back at some point. I'll continue on regardless. So, all right. I guess let me see. The question, the next thing I was going to ask, and I don't know, maybe this is personal, but I hope not. Are you tempted to return?
I think for me, it's like, I making independent games. My way of doing that has been to keep a day job the whole time. At the moment, what's making sense to me is to have a job in academia, and it's difficult to imagine returning in that situation just because there are so few jobs in Melbourne. And if that was to change, yeah, absolutely. I'm not, Melbourne's really cool. so yeah, I mean, I wouldn't rule it out, but yeah, probably not in the short term.
Yeah, I think I would have said, if you'd asked me 5 years ago, I would have said no, there's no chance. It gets hard. Maybe you get nostalgic, but it does get more attractive as time goes on. The tone of the place and the weather, and I do miss the football. I actually while I was waiting to get on this chat, I was streaming the game from the Friday night. Still a Carlton fan, but don't spoil the result. I'm not even in there. But
Carlton's going great. They're doing well.
But so I think there's something in that. But when you have an opportunity, to work on something big, they're hard to find wherever you are. So it seems it's very difficult to turn your back on the opportunity to make a big game and work with a huge group of incredibly talented people and find a very large audience. And at least at the moment, the kind of games I've been working on would be impossible to do in Melbourne. But that lure of doing something smaller and doing something more intimate is attractive. So it's possible, but it would be, for me at least, a complete change in the kind of projects I was working on, and a complete change in what I was doing.
Siobhan, we have you back.
Sorry, I pressed the wrong button.
Right. I was just asking whether you're tempted to return to Australia.
Yeah, always. But our life is here though, so it's like that. Yeah, sadly. I'd love to. I don't know what you guys said, but yeah, I think especially now when I see so much going on and there's so much energy, and I'm just kind of addicted to what's going on in the arcade. I think it's really, really cool. And but yeah, I also equally love Movie Molecule, and we're not finished yet. We still have things to do, and it feels very much like until we do that, what I would like to do instead is probably just kind of get to know the Australian game developers a bit more and kind of keep a bit more in touch. And I was really happy to be asked to do this or just get involved with GCAP, because I sort of realised that in meeting like other, I didn't know any other Aussie game developers until I went to GCAP, and I've met like so many people through that. But it's just, I find the idea very interesting of actually working on a game with Australians. We have Aussies here, we have a few. You know what I mean? Like I haven't made a game with like in my own place. I've made them always here, and I don't know what it would feel like. Maybe it would be really annoying. I don't know. But I sort of there's some frames of reference that people here like constantly talk about that I don't have, and I'm like, okay, yeah, but Take Heart. A lot of Little Big Planet, the influence is this program called Take Heart. And I don't ever remember watching that. I don't think we had that. I certainly didn't watch it when I was a little kid, but it's basically this very important British children's television show where they were taught how to draw and paint and by Tony Hart, and it was like important, you know. Pretty much most people who are creative, who I work with here, would have been influenced by that program. And so like there's different frames of reference that I would have, as like the way that I played or where I played, or you know, playing out in the creek, or you know, I mean that's kind of a pretty enough thing to say, but I mean like my references are different, and I think that my music references are different. My life was very different to how people grew up here. So, and I think as we get older, particularly, I don't know if everyone does this, but I think particularly at this age where most people in their late 30s, or a lot of people are in their late 30s, early 40s, having families, a lot comes up about like your childhood and what you were doing and what you were thinking, and so in that respect in particular, it's kind of interesting to think, well, what would it be like if every day I was actually collaborating and jamming with people who were different but had a similar frame of reference.
Yeah, we could make a squiggle game. It would fit with Bennett's crop aesthetic. I think it would work. It would be like a dream.
And we could voice it in like really Aussie voices. That'd be
yeah,
great.
exactly.
There we go.
Honestly, if this panel results in an international Mr. Squiggle game collaboration,
I actually recently did look up Mr. Squiggle videos because, well, I just wanted to remember the little tractor. Was it the tractor, like the angry tractor?
Yeah.
And I didn't realise that when, like, after I stopped watching it, like, it obviously continued on and like got modernised. I was like, whoa, what's happened?
So, I mean, maybe at this point, yeah, I mean, it's a good point to ask about the community of Australians overseas. I mean, Siobhan, you were saying that you work with Australians in your studio.
Yeah.
Is it common to run into Australians in the game development community internationally?
Well, in the UK, I've always worked with a handful of Aussies. Like in every place I've been at, there's always been a handful, and actually, always like really high caliber people. And here at the moment, we have like myself and Stefan, and then Alex is Alex, and is half Australian, and Porter or something. And then we had another guy that just left, Sean. So we don't have that many right now, but yeah, there's always been Aussies about.
Yeah, we've got a couple as well. I mean, the Montreal studio here is pretty crazy in that you have obviously a lot of Quebecers, a lot of Canadians, a lot of French, a bunch of Americans. But every team I've been on has had a couple of Australians as well. So they're all floating around.
Yeah.
There's an amazing.
Yeah, you always have like a couple of French people, always like maybe, yeah, and then there'll usually be like some Aussie somewhere in the corner somewhere.
Yeah.
In good shit.
I guess the thing is, in independent games, you're not having to travel for a job so much. So you tend to see Australians at events, and then they don't tend to just be living here because they wouldn't be able to get the authorization to live here unless they had a job.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, people do come through New York. My colleagues always come running down the hallway. They're like, Bennett, there's an Australian here. You've got to meet them. I'm like, yes, an Australian.
Yeah, but I think that's funny as well. I don't know if you guys had the same thing, but I remember when I arrived in America, for a while people would always tell me to join some Australian club, or go to some Australian event. And I kept telling them, if I wanted to hang out with Australians right now, I would have stayed where they all live. You know, the whole point of going here is to meet Americans and hear what they had to say, and then meet, you know, Canadians and Europeans and all that sort of stuff. But now I think I'm more open to it. But yeah, it was the absolute last thing on my list was the idea of going down and eating Vegemite sandwiches and drinking a Foster's.
Do you think that's kind of an Australian thing, though, especially because we're so far away from everything else, right? That, like, I know, you know, when I've been backpacking, like, if I turn up at a hostel and someone's playing, like, a playlist of Australian music, I'm like, I'm going somewhere else, you know? Like, I don't even want to be reminded of that. Is that an Australian thing?
I think that's universal. I think my wife is Dutch, and she has the same thing about Dutch people whenever we run into them abroad or whatever. I think there's my pet theory is that when you hear idiocy from your own country, you have a sense of ownership. It's like your family being awful. Whereas you see idiocy from other cultures and you think, oh, those people, and you can tolerate it. You know what I mean? But from your own backyard, it's just you want to go over and help.
Yeah, no, I've heard that too. You know, when I was at Oxford, and there's all these weird traditions, and you've got to wear gowns to dinner and pass the port to the left and all of this stuff. And English people find it, you know, super embarrassing. And I've heard that the strongest, the people who are perpetuating those strange traditions as hard as possible is the Australians and Kiwis. And because it's to us, it's like we don't own it. It's, you know, it's tourism. Yeah. So look, I think that there is a pleasure in being overseas and being the only Australian. There is a kind of a pleasure in that, and having a slightly different perspective than the people that you're talking to. But yeah, I'm sort of like getting over that gradually over time as well.
Siobhan, similar feelings?
Yeah, I mean, I guess when I lived here, when I first moved to, well, after a bit of a period, but when I was first living in London, I lived in an English shared house for a while, but I was like very young and quite naive, and I actually then was a bit like, please, I think I might need to live with people who are Australian and come from the same place. So I went and lived in a shared house in Tooting and had like a ball. It was brilliant fun. But also it was just that same thing of like being pretty young, being, you know, in this new place and not really quite understanding it, and thinking that maybe it was more similar than it was, and then realizing actually just because we speak the same language doesn't actually mean that we have like that's pretty much as far that's the similarity, and then there's a lot of very subtle differences and some really big differences. And it kind of took me a little bit of time to get my head around that. Of like, you know, Australia is very different from England. The Australian temperament is very different, and I really enjoyed going home and being able to like talk about things that were familiar to me, and you know, and that so. But yeah, and now like I live in the English countryside. There's not very many Aussies around. So I do really enjoy it when I can like catch up with people, what's going on, particularly because like politics in Australia is so fascinating right now. I feel very sorry for everyone who's actually having to live there, but
fascinating.
It's a very interesting time, and I think that there's been, so I really enjoy like talking about it and finding out what's going on and finding out. So I'm probably that like annoying Australian who meets one and goes, tell me everything that you know up until this point.
So before I ask, I've sort of got last two final questions. So I just want to say for those of you watching on the Twitter stream, if there's any questions that you wanted to ask, now would be the time to start typing them out. That's the hashtag FreePlay15, that is, if anyone is wanting desperately to ask something. So one of the other things that I was going to ask is, I mean, it does seem like it's not uncommon, especially after, you know, what happened with the studios closing down a few years ago, etc. in Australia, that it isn't, you know, uncommon to find Australians living and working internationally. So I wonder, in that sense, is Australian game culture international in some respects?
Yes.
I think that in the sense that most game teams I've worked on have been international, I think it's inescapable. I mean, there's a bunch of Aussies down at Valve. You know, I know a few at pretty much any company. I could name a few people that are working there. So I think gaming is pretty international. And Australian, the Australian voice is definitely part of it.
Yeah, I think that every team that I've been on, there's always some countries that are always represented, and there's there's always English people, there's always some Americans and Canadians, definitely some French people, French programmer. You're not really a games team if you have a French programmer, probably. And then there's definitely Aussies, and then definitely some Chinese representation, and I've had Japanese too, Egyptian. We actually have a full spread here, but all the games teams I've worked on have been international. I've never worked on a games team that's just one nationality. I think that would just be totally weird, and that would feel like not a games team. I mean, I guess unless there's 2 people.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of countries that have been in Australia's shoes for this. I mean, it's if you're from a country that didn't have a big enough games market, you had to look abroad, and that in the 80s, I guess that was even there might have been a good market across a couple of hours drive away, but just not within your own country, and people there's been a kind of diaspora everywhere.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's not just the Australians in that regard. It is a massively international scene.
Yeah.
So, then the final question: how do you think of yourselves? I know that you, sorry, I don't mean to, get
pretty awesome.
So I mean, you've been living internationally for a while, I guess. So do you see yourself as an Australian living in this place, or do you see yourself as just someone living in this place who was born in Australia, or is there
I feel inescapably Australian.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, I think I left when I was 27. It's been a long time. So actually, almost the entirety of my working career has been overseas, sort of 15 years, whatever, overseas, 14 years. And so my life, the things that I've done have all been expressed as someone who's somewhere else. But the me that's done it is always Australian. I'm always the loudest generally. I'm always, there's a tone that you're aware that people acknowledge that you're Australian that I don't think I'll ever shake. I don't want to anyway. I'm stuck with it now. Too old.
I don't think you can forget it. I mean, I think especially it's not so much like this in England, because there's more Australians. But in the Americas, it's just people not understanding the things that you're saying and looking at you as though you're speaking a foreign language. That my wife tried to buy a chicken pot pie, and the guy gave her a papaya. So you can't forget it, and I think you just do. I mean, I'm not sure if that's the only thing propping it up, but I definitely do feel as though being an Australian is a core part of my identity. And I can say that without also saying, I mean, I don't. It's not like I miss being in Australia. Like I said, I think particularly the scene in Melbourne is really cool in games, and I think Melbourne is a cool city, and I wouldn't be sad at all to be living there. But I don't think I miss it in the sense of being like an expat. I guess I've kind of lost that feeling. But yeah, it's just, I think there is a sense in which I feel Australian.
How's the tipping?
I think it would be very difficult to, definitely. I would never be, I don't know what else I would be, actually.
Right.
I definitely couldn't consider myself to be English, because I'm not English, and I'm not British.
Yeah.
And I can't be. We're just a very different. I love it here. So it's sort of, yeah. So I was born in South Africa, so I'm like a mongrel, proper mongrel, basically. But I definitely, my heart and definitely I definitely feel Australian, and that's how I would respond.
I think Siobhan's ready to go back. I'm reading between the lines here. Open satellite studio.
I'm actually going back on Thursday. That's probably why I'm like.
There you go. Let's talk offline, Siobhan. Let's make a plan.
Do you return flight? Is that the? We have one question on the Twitter hashtag. There's actually been a whole lot of action on the Twitter hashtag, but not so many direct questions at this point. Although there has been a few people saying that they want the panels to continue forever, so they're trying to think of questions to ask. Izzy asks, and she apologizes. She says it's super broad, but she says, "What would you like to see from Australian games developed in the future?"
For me, really strong opinions. Like, I think there's way too much imitation in the indie scene of the rest of the games industry, you know. And I really do not need to play another Super Nintendo game in 2015. You know, make me something offensive or outlandish or challenging or outrageous that I could not get away with making in my job. That's really what I want to see.
I just want one good cricket game, just one in the history of the media.
That is like definitely someone who doesn't live in Australia is saying that.
I changed my answer. I'm going with the cricket thing as well.
Oh, come on! I suppose I live near a cricket pitch, so like very close to me there is the ability to watch cricket and have scones. I'd love to do something that I would like to see something that really had a very Australian story and there's a very I think that I see it from the outside. I'm always on the outside kind of looking in, and there is a very interesting history to draw upon and a lot of different types of people, but there's just a rich there's something there, and I think that that would be interesting. It's in games sometimes we just put these skins over things, and we're like making some sort of game, and then we apply the skin on top. But actually, like the best things that I ever played, or the best music, or the best movies, they always like come from somewhere deeply personal. And I think that there's an interesting, there's something there within the Australian games that kind of hasn't been done yet, and I'd love to experience that. And I think that there's so many options there that I can't even, too many to even start whittling about.
So we also have actually a really good question from Rebecca Fernandez, who I believe, hi Rebecca, has just moved internationally herself. She says, she says, do you have any advice for other Australians who've moved away from Australia for work?
For me, it's behave as though you're never going back, even if you're secretly worried that you are. Make friends from that place, get involved in the local scene, stay away from Australians. You know what I mean? Basically, act like you've torn up your return ticket, and you'll have a much better time. And even if one day you wake up and decide it's time to go back, you will have really got something out of it.
I think that's excellent advice. I didn't follow that advice for a few years, and I was very in the middle, 1 foot in, 1 foot out of England, and then it came to a real crunch point where I kind of allowed all of the things that bothered me to mount up to a point where it just really was. I wasn't getting the full experience, and it actually took a near return, basically selling all of our belongings, having the return ticket, having the farewell party booked, to then making the decision together, my boyfriend and I, that we would stay. And this was 15 years ago or something, ages ago. And the really big thing that I had to decide that weekend when we were making the decision was, can I actually just get over all of the things that I don't like about it here and enjoy myself, rather than constantly thinking, well, it'd be better if I was here, or it'd be better if I was there, or because I completely agree with Alex. If you don't allow yourself to just fully get into the wherever you are, you're just not going to make. You'll not make the most of it, because you can always go back, but it's just a life half lived, basically.
Yeah.
we have a less good question. I think Alex, this is directed at you. Brendan Keogh asks, "How's the Carlton game going?" I won't get you to answer that one, actually.
I don't know, but I predict a miserable season again. So it's it's not a happy day.
Yeah. Look, I'm really sorry to inform you at this point that I'm a Collingwood supporter, but yeah.
I don't think it's going to be much better for you, so I think it's okay.
Oh, I know. I know. Look, I don't think we've got any more questions coming through. I think that's been terrific. Thank you so much for joining us and being so generous with your time. It's really amazing to be able to hold this kind of panel across the globe. So I think we might wrap up then. Thank you to Bennett, Alex, and Siobhan.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Nice to chat.